Welcome to the Bad Boss Journal, the dope podcast where you can anonymously say exactly what you think about your bad boss, toxic work environment, and find out how to handle
it. Welcome back to another episode of the Bad Boss podcast. My name is Michelle, and I'm here with
Ava.
Yep. And yes. Today on our show, we have our guest, Albert. How are you doing today?
Pretty good. Can't complain.
Awesome. Well, I've known Albert for a while, and there has been some drama in terms of bad bosses, and so I thought we would have him on the show. Did you want to share your experiences? I think you said you had more than one.
Yeah. So I started working freelance in 2016, and I think every boss that I've had after I stopped working for a company, all of them happen to be female. It's just out of coincidence more than anything. But a lot of the industries that I work in now, when I work freelance, tends to be female-dominated industries. So the first boss that I want to mention was in 2017, and they're kind of go in chronological order. But yeah, so that was in the fashion industry, and 2018 was the entertainment industry, and 2021, the third boss that I have. It sounds like I'm complaining a lot, but I'll try to be as unbiased as possible, if that's possible. 2020, 2021, that boss was in the journalism field. So yeah.
Oh, cool. Okay, so tell us about the first boss.
So I think the biggest difficulty that I had with her, and this was something that I knew, so I was actually doing coaching for executives in a fashion company. So it was everyone who was, mid or senior level management and higher. And I was doing everything from coaching and doing professional presentations. People were getting help with me from English. And this boss specifically, I was actually teaching French. And there was an opening that lined up, and it was about a 6 to 8 month stint, and it was in public relations, and they needed someone who could speak, all three languages. She and I had a pretty good relationship before that, and I think specifically, in an Asian country, at the end of the day, regardless of how younger I am or whatnot, if I'm teaching you, it still comes from a position where I have something that you don't. So they're still very respectful in that sense. And then, so it was never my boss, if anything, I was kind of teaching them. So they had to, I guess, find some aspect of always trying to maintain that level of, you're like 20 years younger than me, but they were still very professional in that sense, where I never really felt like they were a boss or anything until I started working freelance. And I think the biggest, warning sign or the difficulty that I had with her was that a lot of it was, a term that's really popular in Asia right now, which is gaslighting. And
it's here too. Yeah.
Yeah. No, but I, a lot of those things are influenced by Western culture. So if you look, into keywords and trends from about a year ago, that wasn't a word that people in Asia knew or used. So it's something very recent. And, I think especially in that culture when there's a lot of Confucianism and there's a lot of conservative mentalities that run through, the job aspect, there's a lot of people who think that certain things are the norm, and it is up to a point in terms of a cultural context, but in terms of working atmosphere, it's not necessarily the best. So with her, I think I started feeling that, where there were certain comments made where it was kind of used to manipulate me to get certain results. And for the longest time, for the first couple of months, I did great at my job, and it was something that even when I was having conversations with you, that I mentioned that I was super stressed about work. So, you gave me tips on how to organize myself. And I assumed anything that went well was something that, was because I had put the time in. And if something didn't go well, it was something that, it was out of, my lack of experience. And that's kind of how that message just kept getting fed into my ear, because I actually knew a manager who was between her and I in terms of the social hierarchy, again, which is very, very strong in Asian countries, but especially where I was working. And, I had heard a story about how this boss was a little bit, vindictive. And if there are certain situations where it didn't favor her, and I heard this in a very vague sense because the boss between us, the manager between us, didn't really want to talk about someone behind their backs. When you're working in an industry like PR for a very very big fashion company, your silence is basically your career. And so it was
Yeah.
fine until a certain point. There was a mistake made that was through no fault of anybody's. It was a plane delay for a very important guest, and from that point on, everything that went bad was used, and the blame was put on me just because I was expendable, if that makes sense. And that same situation that I had gone with, that I had experienced, was something that that mid-level manager experienced as well. So it's something that she's very used to. The boss that was totally in charge of the public relations team would do that, would take very specific situations where if something was done and performed very well, she would take the credit for it. But at least with our overall general, I guess, manager, in charge of public relations, if she did that, it was very tit for tat. So if I take credit for something that you did, I would try to give you a chance and try to find some way to return the favor, if that makes
Mm.
sense. I don't really think that's a great boss either, but at least there was something where it was, I'll get my what I'm owed later kind of sense. But there was nothing like that with my direct boss, and if anything, it was kind of always waiting for that moment, when the blame would be put on me. So it hurt my
Yikes.
reputation a lot. I was working freelance at the time, so that's
And
the
you were
year that
working for some really big name luxury companies.
yes, it's one of the top. Um,
Yeah.
and so your reputation precedes you, especially in an industry that's as big as it can be, in terms of how much money they bring in. It's very limited to the people who work. So I've also known, because of the way that she's either very manipulative or she uses, the title that she has with the power of the company and the brand that, we used to at one point both work for, would sometimes, harass certain people from our vendors, for example. That was a very big thing. So once I quit working at that company, everyone knew my boss or knew of my boss. A lot of companies blacklisted her specifically. So there
Wow.
was a very big contract, and there were certain celebrities, that we were trying to work with. Some of the biggest in the industry right now, in terms of, I guess I can mention the country. In terms of Korea, some of the biggest K-pop artists, and the entertainment label actually decided to blacklist working with our company because of that manager.
What?
Yeah.
So yeah.
It sounds like it was very transactional type relationship. And I think it's unique in your case because of it's not necessarily where something you can walk away from. So a lot of people are in these bad boss situations and they can walk away from it. But in this kind of industry, your reputation precedes you. And so,
Yeah.
Mhm.
and even speaking out against somebody who is a bad boss will follow you. So I think, that's one of those unique situations where there's really not a lot of places to turn. What was the physical or emotional impact of that situation on you?
Oh, I think that's the biggest one. So a lot of people don't know this, but that's how, for example, my alopecia started. It was
Mm.
less specifically about that boss, but just about the job in general. I was working officially 5 days a week, but I was at my job 7. I got paid more in overtime than I did in my actual salary, and it's one of those industries, and especially in Korea, there's a lot of industries where if you want to get to a certain place, people will put in that extra effort and log all these ridiculous hours, and like you said, it took a toll on me physically. And so especially when that happened, I do have like anxiety. So the way that I processed that was, oh, that's my fault, so how do I fix this, which I
Mm.
think put a lot of extra stress on me as well. And that's kind of how my journey into alopecia started. And the bosses that came after didn't really help either, but yeah.
Yeah, that sounds totally normal. I mean, it's amazing how, and Michelle can talk to this too, I'm sure, how stress impacts us physically, and we don't even necessarily realize these things are happening.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I feel like, it's interesting because when you talk to people in general, they all know that stress is like what causes disease, right,
Mhm.
in our bodies. But then like when you try to talk to a doctor, they're like, oh no, I mean, yeah, it'll kind of make you stressed out, of course, but it's not going to no, like I've had my body fully shut down
Oh yeah.
because of so much physical stress. I mean, there are countless stories. I mean, you can just go online and look it up. I mean, all of these self-help people, like half of them went through something like that.
Right.
Or all the health people, like just not even self-help, but if you go into like all the health stuff, like paleo and keto, a lot of these people, they all start these, healing slash eating journeys because they're trying to fix something that the doctors or whoever couldn't, wouldn't believe them. And I've had friends who've, completely had their adrenal glands shut down. I personally got PCOS and I don't think that, our family doesn't have a genetic thing towards PCOS. I'm the first one in our entire family who has something like this. And so, yeah, I feel like stress is huge. And I know with, knowing Albert, like the journey he had to go through, oh my goodness, it was so rough. Yeah, I mean, I remember during that time, it's like, and then like you get stressed on top of everything that's already stressing you out because of the pain and like the discomfort you're in.
Yep.
Yeah.
And in Korea, where, image is so important, it's a very superficially, materialistic type of place in a sense. I'm not trying to make it sound like it's vapid, but like appearance has a lot to do with like your status and how people see you, and there's a lot of like judgment that goes around with that. And then on top of that, you're in the fashion industry, you know what I mean? Like I cannot imagine how stressful that can be for a person to deal with.
So what I used to say, and just to try to be, very well balanced, because there's always the strength of it too, is I always say, not necessarily to a specific culture or race, but having worked in Korea, they're very visually sensitive people, and that can work in terms of someone's favor. There's a lot of, for example, people, I have friends and acquaintances who, work in DreamWorks, for example. I don't know if I'm allowed to mention brands, but who
Yeah.
work in, who work, doing very specific, highly sensitive things in terms of a visual area. And that doesn't always necessarily, like you said, translate into a positive thing. If you have certain skill sets, it could be great, but sometimes if you're always constantly looking at things and trying to find, for example, the difference, or finding something that doesn't look like me or doesn't, relate to what a certain standard is, it does become very difficult. And I think that was one of the reasons why ultimately when I was offered a full-time job at that brand in that specific team, I just decided to turn it down. And at that point, I think it was more because that's when I first started freelancing. So I wanted to experience a lot of, different things, instead of going back into an industry that I was already working. So in hindsight, I think I'm really thankful for it. I think I could probably do a lot better in terms of how I managed it, the second time around. But, it's less about regret and more about experience, about how I guess, adjust to certain people, how I react to certain people, and how I kind of deal with my own stress. Or, sometimes even in theory, the easiest thing is just saying no. Or, when I see people manipulating me, just, finding very easy, I guess, ways to kind of counteract that. But I think at that time, it was my kind of sense of always having to, please my boss, or, having worked in,
Hmm.
for example, the service industry, the beginning of my career, I think it was always trying to make sure everybody was pleased. So yeah.
Yeah, that's huge in the customer service industry too. Like, I feel like every job I've done, even though it's so varied and wide, for the first 10 years, it all was surrounded around customer experience.
Mhm.
So there was
Uh-huh.
always like that customer service aspect to it. That's huge. And I feel like because they drill it into you, it almost becomes a part of you, right? But I feel like now that I look back on it, I was like, man, I feel like I was just brain warped in a sense.
Yeah, like you were duped.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do think it makes me an overall nicer person because, and I think like my varied work experiences makes me very mindful of how I treat others when I'm out and about, right? Like anytime I go to a restaurant or a store, it doesn't matter how bad my day is going or how mean anybody is to me. I purposefully, like, it's like I almost like try to kill them with kindness, and it always works, right? So, I mean, I don't know if that's 100% great, but at the same time, I'm like, I feel like it's better than just being mean. If that makes sense, just I don't know. That's why I personally have a really hard time with things like that when people are like, "Oh, be you," but I'm like, if I was really me, I
Yeah.
can't leave this house. Like, I have a very specific hat that I've created for getting out of the house and being kind to other people, and then getting what I need.
So, Albert, tell us a little bit about the Bad Boss in 2018.
Yeah. So she was one of those. I just kind of continued. It was a different job that I took. Again, that was a 1 year contract from 2018, and it was specifically to utilize my skills in terms of bringing in certain artists and having them perform abroad. And there were a very specific subset of music in Korea that's very either traditional or folk based. And the bigger part of what I was doing was promoting those teams. I would bring a lot of them abroad, and I was trying to basically sell them and to certain like festivals or concerts and whatnot. And I think the biggest difficulty was that she was a very type A personality. So, had to, is a very big perfectionist. And I admit now that because I worked under a specific boss like her, compared to the first boss I had in 2017, she was, I guess, I don't know if it's a good thing, but one of the biggest things that people have said that was the difficulty was that she was not good at her job. She didn't know enough about the industry, but she also kind of said, do your own thing. And she really didn't give any guidance. Whereas the boss I had in 2018 was very micromanaging, never had a smile on her face, was constantly saying things that would kind of, I don't know. I always feel like at the end of the day, people need to kind of be inspired in a positive way in order to continue working and getting results. She was very negative, didn't like really communicating, expected you to understand before coming to her with questions was kind of how you kind of got attacked. And so yeah, she was just one of those bosses where it was just you're kind of always walking on eggshells, which was very similar to
Mm-hmm.
the most recent boss I had in 2020 2021.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you hit it on the nail that she was not good at her job. And so basically that defensiveness came out on her employees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So, what were some of the things that she did or said to you that really kind of was one of those things where you're like, aha, I need to get out of this?
I don't think it was like a very big thing. I think it was just the atmosphere that was created around her personality. And she
Mm,
again micromanaging. She was always it's I always tell people it's not exactly what you say, but it's how you say it. So the atmosphere when I walked in, and I only worked that job for 1 year. I came in specifically for certain events. So for the most time, I was only working from Monday through Wednesday, full time.
mm,
And I did my other, I guess, gigs throughout the rest of the week. And I think it was like those microaggressions. I guess that would be the correct term to use. I don't think
mm.
there was that she was always necessarily shouting or, it was always, but everyone, even people who were of higher positions than her, it was a very pretty small company, but I think everybody kind of walked on eggshells around her. So,
Yikes.
when you're in that kind of nervous mindset, I feel like sometimes you have to, especially for people who don't have the best self-esteem, who aren't necessarily very confident in what they're doing, they kind of need to be really gassed in the good way, like you're doing great, keep up the good work. But I think because everybody was under that kind of nervousness, a lot more mistakes were being made, and it was sometimes specific like comments that were made that would kind of just shut down everyone's environment at work, things
So,
like that.
was she one of those people that felt like unpleased every time? So, like, you felt the need to constantly have to please her? So, like, was she very, like, would she just like act indifferent anytime you would bring her, you know, something that she said she needed or finished a project when she needed? And was it that type of thing?
I think so because I think she reacted like that to everybody, and I kind of get and a lot of what people tried to pass it off as or try to give her a little bit of the benefit of the doubt was she was technically working as both a performer in her own ensemble, and she was also the head of the entertainment company, so she was balancing two very
Mm,
full-time
right.
jobs. Specifically the team that she performed with, they were abroad I think 86 days that specific year. They were outside of
Wow.
boundaries. So
Yeah.
I do understand that, when you're high stressed and high strung, like you can't necessarily always be smiling, but in terms of, making or maintaining a certain working atmosphere, sometimes you just have to smile and, sometimes have to make sure that you're encouraging people. I always tell my friends and my clients around me that you're not necessarily supposed to make friends at work. I think that's really wishful thinking, and it's happened before. And it's great when it does. When you find like, wow, I've
Mm-hmm.
actually found a friend at work. And I always tell people, you don't have to make friends. I think that's a lot of wishful thinking, especially when I was younger in my career. I always thought, I always have to make friends at work, but I threw that away very quickly. But just being friendly, I think, is asking for a lot too sometimes. But it's not something totally crazy. I think, you don't doesn't require that much more effort or energy, and it's not necessarily something that comes at a cost, but it helps at least maintain a certain atmosphere at work. But that definitely did not exist. So
Mm.
That's interesting that you say that, because I think I've learned that in my like super bad boss experience over the last 2 years is that, yeah, I don't, friends at work is a bonus. Just, as long as we can respect each other, I
Mm-hmm.
think it is a win. And you talked about your boss not yelling, but still the toxicity of the atmosphere. I found the same thing, that even when they don't talk to you, that's a toxic environment when you're
yeah,
getting no
Mm.
communication from your boss.
Yeah.
a lot of silence in that job. And we were
Right.
all in
Wow.
cubicles facing each other. And she always sat at one end just so she could monitor everybody. But, my workstation was facing the entrance of the office. So it was kind of like the easiest spot to be, I
Away
guess.
from her eye.
No, I mean, that's where everybody walked in. Everyone could see my monitor.
Oh, right, right, right.
Walk by,
Mm.
I was kind of in the middle of the room. And we were all, our cubicles were all kind of facing each other, if that makes sense.
Mm.
So, yeah.
I remember when my cubicle, where my back faced the entrance to the office, and I hated it because like I couldn't even do anything. Like it always had to look like I was super productive. Like I felt like I could never get off time. And I guess you're not supposed to, but it just felt like everybody could see what I was doing.
Yeah.
And it's not like I was trying to goof off, but it was just, I don't know. It was just
You
so
just feel
weird.
like you're monitored, and a lot of it is just
Yeah.
human instinct. If you're working, facing a wall, and the entrance is behind you, and there's people
Yeah.
constantly coming in and out, like it, you start, when you do make a mistake, or sometimes you do take a break, you start feeling, specifically depending on where her desk was, where she could kind of manage everybody, and you couldn't really see anything until you walked behind her cubicle to talk to her. So
Mm.
you start feeling monitored sometimes. Um,
Yeah.
Again, not that I was, slacking off, but it's just a feeling you get with a specific boss like that, I think. But yeah.
Yeah. So what is that third boss story you have?
So in terms of personality, it was very similar to the second boss. My first boss was very, I don't really care, very laissez-faire, do what you need to do. I just need those results so that I can take credit for it. Whereas the second and third boss were very micromanaging. They were perfectionists to a fault.
Mm.
And the third one was when I worked in journalism. So she was a producer for two shows. And the show that I was a guest for, that I worked as a guest MC, my slot was only on Mondays. And so it was about 15, 20 minute slot that I did for radio. And she, because again, I try to give her the same benefit of the doubt. Perfectionist is juggling two, full-time positions, working as a producer for two different shows. And I didn't really know it because I had met her originally for the guest show that I did, and then she liked the work that I did, and so she hired me to be a writer for the second show that she was working on, and this was kind of her baby. So, it was, there was a singer that was the MC. He's kind of getting pretty famous. He was on a TV show, so this was kind of her baby. She put so much time and effort and blood, sweat, and tears into it, and it was a very specific job that I had to do. So when it didn't make that criteria, if I didn't meet the criteria of what she wanted, again, it was the delivery. It's not necessarily what she said, but how she said it. And, sometimes jokingly, she would blame the fact that, that she was, educated in the UK. So she said, I'm not that emotional. I know that for a lot of my American co-producers, they said that, she comes off very aloof or very chic, and people have, and even I've said that to her jokingly, that you have a very, you know, what I would assume is a very British type sense of humor, for example, a little bit dry, and she admitted it, so I always assumed that was kind of her baseline. So when she never really smiled, or when people cracked a joke, it was very forced. And we were even talking about things like MBTIs at work, because it was a very popular topic in Korea in the past year. And I just kind of assumed that it was because of her personality. But I think for these types of people who are perfectionists and go-getters, it's, if it's not done the way I like it, and their true kind of personalities come out, and there's no, I
Mm.
guess, limit in terms of how, they kind of show their emotions. Because I think people are afforded mistakes, but when you're kind of creating that atmosphere, I think, no matter who you're working with, even though people try to work, harder and try to make less mistakes, no one's necessarily going to be giving their best work, I think, when you're constantly in that, I guess, nervous state of mind, or if there's always that energy in the workplace. But yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, it reminds me of like if when you're a little kid and if somebody yells at you or your parents tell you don't do a certain thing or don't spill something, like it's so much harder not to spill something or to be a klutz when you're a kid. And that's what I imagine that situation's like, is that
Yeah.
when people are so nervous, they can't help but continue to spill the milk.
Yeah.
Right. Or you freeze under pressure because you're just like, I can't do it right. No matter what I do, there's always something going wrong.
Yeah.
I don't even know what to do anymore, you know?
Yeah.
Especially my last boss, I think she was like that. So again, it's radio. I understand that, things are live and things are pre-recorded. But there was a guest that came on. I got my second vaccine that week. And so I was running like 102-degree fever, but I was working throughout that whole week just to make sure those guests were, really well taken care of. But of course, certain mistakes happened. And, the fact that she, not only to me, but everyone who was working on the team, was constantly just blowing up. And in front of the guests. So I think to call yourself a perfectionist, but especially for me, we're having worked in, customer service for so long, it's to not necessarily show those types of, when you're losing, your sense of, emotion and kind of backlashing at people. But for her to be doing that in front of the guests was when I really realized, wow, so what I've experienced until now really wasn't professionalism, if that makes sense. But
Huh. So she would yell at her coworkers in front of guests?
yeah. And so a lot of it was, especially with my personality and my anxiety, I assumed like, oh, I did something wrong, I made mistakes. But that's, everyone, if that happens, it happens. And especially if a guest, that you invited on a show sees it, the best thing to do is kind of move on, find the best possible solution. And, if you want to yell at your guests, you can go ahead and, to your staff, you can go ahead and do that later. But
Do you think
that's
it was
kind
a
of what I
power
realized.
struggle? Like it was a power move, like to do that in front of people that were
The second
kind
boss
of,
did that for sure. That now that you
okay.
mention it, a lot of it was because, and she's mentioned that she has a lot of those insecurities because she was very petite. I think she was 4'10", 4'11", my second boss. So she would always kind of have, and she told me jokingly whenever we would have like a drink or hang out, that she did definitely have that Napoleon complex. And, people would kind
Mhm.
of say that to her too. Like she was a little general. And I don't think it was really said, like said in a way that it was a compliment, if you know what I mean. But
Yeah.
the third boss was not necessarily like that. I think it's her level of perfectionism, just, and that mixture of stress, and the way that she deals with normally talking to people just kind of hit, the fan, so to speak. But yeah.
Mm.
Mm.
That's so unprofessional though.
Yeah.
And I think the kind of turning point for me was, I thought until that point, I thought, so professional, is constantly, micromanaging, is a perfectionist. So I assumed that everything that stemmed out of that was a need to make sure that everything was done exactly right, if that makes sense. And when I see certain things like that, that's still a part of professionalism. And if anything, the biggest part. Because, I always tell people you can do the best job, but if you don't seem that way, or if you don't want to be someone that people want to work with, or people don't feel necessarily comfortable around, again, it's not being friends, but at least being friendly might, or even being respectful, I think, is that biggest baseline, like you mentioned, that we could have. But yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Totally.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing
Oh
your
yeah.
stories. Um, If there was one thing you would tell someone who was in any of those situations, advice would you give them?
I think the biggest advice that I got from a lot of people, just from people around me, the people who have known that is, I guess, not letting you start, especially for the first boss, and that's kind of was a habit with the second and third boss that I've had as well, is that you start putting those insecurities on yourself. And yes, I think you have to be very pragmatic and very practical in terms of, if I made a mistake, that's fine. Own up to it. Don't let the anxiety get to you. Find the fastest way to fix it, and don't do it again. But there are certain things that you do that aren't, sometimes is not necessarily a fault of your own, but it could be miscommunication. Certain things happen. People are allowed or afforded certain mistakes. But I think when you work with certain people like that, they're always they give off that image that since they're perfectionists and they're professionals, those mistakes always kind of come onto you. And so not to blame yourself too much, I guess, because sometimes, like I said, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a sense when you start
Mhm.
blaming yourself too much. And even though you could be doing a good job, it's just kind of being very realistic in terms of, what did I do, not to blame myself for certain things and things like that. But yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing your stories.
No, it was a good little trip down memory lane.
I hope it was a good trip and not a traumatic one, reliving everything.
Yeah, it was okay.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for the Bad Boss Journal. If you have a story that you'd like to share, you can go to thebadbossjournal.com and share your story there. Until next time, we'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Do you have a bad boss experience you'd like to share with us? Visit our website, thebadbossjournal.com, to submit your story. You can also support our show by checking out our merch and more on our website. Thank you so much for listening to the Bad Boss Journal.